Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel. So for today's video, I kind of want to have a longer form discussion surrounding my thoughts on the transgender and non-binary characters in Star Trek Discovery, and specifically their representation in the most recent episode of the season, which at the time of this recording was the 4th episode of the 3rd season, Forget Me Not. Now, for many of you who have already seen my review of that episode, I clearly had a lot of thoughts and a lot of complex feelings after watching it. And I made that review literally right after watching the episode. So I wasn't able to clearly articulate or come to terms with what my exact thoughts on the representation and the episode were when it came to these non-binary and transgender characters, namely Adira and Gray in the episode. And also I should say I am going to be doing full spoilers on the episode. So if you have not seen the episode yet, just know I am going to go full bore into spoilers here. But after having sat with the episode for a few days now and really kind of let it percolate in my head, I've kind of come to the determination that I still have very complicated feelings. I'm not here to condemn the episode or overly praise the episode. But what I do find it to be is incredibly interesting. And now that I've sat with it for those few days, I'm better able to articulate exactly what I'm thinking and processing when it comes to that episode and these characters. And some of my concerns and also praises towards how these characters have been portrayed thus far on the show. And all this goes with an asterisk, by the way, that this may all change as the season goes on. I may start to hate it more, I may start to love it more. So we're just talking about my thoughts going off of the 4th episode of the season. And again, I just want to be clear here. I am not here to condemn this or to overly praise it. I actually am finding this whole situation to be incredibly intriguing, and it's just led me to do a lot of thinking, which is what Star Trek should do. But whether I have issues with it or not, I think it's a really cool chance to have a learning opportunity for myself and for many people out there who may not have encountered these issues within the trans and non-binary community or representation in this kind of specific way, because it intermingles a lot of important issues when we talk about trans and non-binary representation in television and film. So the first thing that I want to talk about on that note is the writer's use of the bury your gaze trope in Star Trek Discovery. Now, for those of you who don't know, the bury your gaze trope is a unfortunately very often used trope within media, in film, in television, that basically amounts to LGBTQ characters being killed off fairly quickly after being introduced, or at least killed off at some point in the narrative, of gay or LGBTQ characters in general never getting a chance to fully live a full life within the context of the actual narrative of the thing that we're watching. This trope mainly comes out of the Hays Code era of Hollywood way back in like the 50s and 60s, where things like showing gay characters was not seen as a good thing, with many religious organizations and the United States government basically saying, oh, you can't show certain things in media because it's not good for the kids, and gay representation was part of that, unfortunately, even though that's very homophobic in many different ways. But what it led to was, if you showed a gay character within your story, you then had to kill them off by the end of the story as punishment for them being gay. Basically sort of incepting this idea that being gay was something worthy to be punished, that you had to be killed off or punished by the story or narrative for just being gay. Obviously, we can clearly see the homophobic resonance there. But unfortunately, even when the Hays Code disappeared, this trope has kind of stuck around in slightly different ways. And I've done a whole video talking about the bury your gaze trope with a Disney context, so you can check that for more information on it. But basically what it's come to today is the bury your gaze trope is basically when a gay character is introduced into a narrative and then killed off for shock value. We've seen this in many shows like The 100, Lovecraft Country did this very recently, and I did a video on that as well. Star Trek Discovery itself did this way back in its 1st season when it killed off Hugh Culber. And it's basically when a gay character is just killed off and there's no real depth to it. It's just like a shocking moment within the narrative or story. And while that can be done effectively, we see that in many shows like Game of Thrones, it's particularly harmful to LGBTQ representation, not only because it comes off of a homophobic trope from the Hays Code, but also LGBTQ characters get so little representation in media. We still don't have a lot of gay characters or queer characters or trans characters or non-binary characters. So to have them killed off in a sort of callous, off-the-cuff sort of way, and the fact that we are also killed off more often than straight characters leads many queer people to be really, really hurt when that happens. For example, using the Culber example, Star Trek as a show built up Hugh Culber as this really important character, big representation for LGBTQ characters in Star Trek, something that Star Trek had wanted for a very long time. And so a lot of gay fans of Star Trek, or LGBTQ fans of Star Trek, really invested in the character of Hugh, and Stamets as well. And we got invested in him because, like, yes, we finally see ourselves in our favorite franchise. And then they kill him off. And you built up so much emotion and caring for this character, someone that you're finally getting to see yourself in. The show itself kind of built that up in sort of the promotion of the show, and then you kill him off for a shock value. And that just honestly incredibly, incredibly hurts. And thankfully, it was something that Star Trek Discovery tried to retroactively fix in its second season when it brought Culber back. They realized it was something that they did wrong. So bringing this into the discussion that we're having now about the non-binary and trans characters was the fact that I was rather perturbed that we got the character of Gray introduced in this episode, who was the boyfriend of Adira that we saw within this, the Trill character who was the original host of Tal in the episode, that he was killed off before we even met him in the story. Again, Star Trek Discovery, the writers of Discovery and the promotion around Discovery really promoted this transgender character coming into Star Trek, saying it's a big moment for our representation of seeing this trans character. So many people got excited. I got very excited to see Gray in the show. And his very first episode, he's killed off in the background. He doesn't even have agency in the present day story. It's sort of a backstory, background element for Adira's character, rather than for his own character. So it's sort of this motivation for another character, which is also fridging, which is another trope that we could talk about, but it also goes into the bury your gays trope here. So that was frustrating to see. But here's where it gets to my complex feelings, because that would be something that I would condemn the show for. However, the reason I have somewhat complex feelings on it is because Gray is not gone from the show. As we saw at the end of the episode, and has come out in other interviews and things with Ian Alexander, I believe is the name of the actor who plays Gray. Gray is going to have a recurring presence on the show as sort of a memory within Adira. So he will still have a presence, and an active presence, mind you, within the show, within the actual going forward narrative. So it's not like his death precludes that, which is often the case in many other forms. It's still problematic because he's still dead and he still did that, but it is interesting that he is still going to have somewhat of a presence within the show going forward, and presumably as long as Adira has his memories, he will probably still be able to be a presence within the show. And as we know, Adira is going to be appearing in Star Trek Discovery Season 4. They already announced that. So Adira is going to be here with us for a very, very long time, and therefore Gray presumably could be as well. So the bury your gays trope is the thing that happened here, but it didn't preclude the character from being present and active within the narrative of the show. So it's an interesting kind of subversion of that trope, and again, gets to me why I wouldn't be fully on the condemned train of this representation. Now, this also gets us into the other trope that I wanted to talk about, and my other potential concern with representation of non-binary and transgender characters within this season of Star Trek Discovery. And that is the use of telling queer storylines, queer themes and ideas through alien metaphor. Again, I've already done a video, a very funny and comedic video, talking about how there is this tendency, especially within science fiction, to use aliens to talk about different issues in different formats. One of the most obvious examples that I can give right off the top of my head would be from the original series of Star Trek, where we had Let This Be Your Final Battlefield, where we had those two aliens that were used to talk about racism, but didn't actually use a person of color to tell that story, basically sort of transplanting that stuff onto alien metaphor. And this is something that has been done for queer issues throughout Star Trek as well, most notably in The Outcast, the Next Generation episode where we met the Janai, which were a non-binary alien species, though that storyline, while it did dovetail with transgender issues, was intended by the writers to be a more focused story about sexuality. Again, I've done a whole video on that if you want to talk about my thoughts on that episode. I've done many videos on these topics, so if you want some backstory, I've got those. But more notably still are the Trill. The Trill on Deep Space Nine and Next Generation, and specifically the character of Dax, the alien species where they can get a host in them and have memories of their past lives, was read by many transgender people, myself included, as a transgender metaphor. Now, there is some debate about whether or not that was actually intended by the writers of the show. Clearly, they also used Dax for a sexuality metaphor in one other episode of Deep Space Nine, but Dax being a explicit, intentionally meant to evoke transgender themes and ideas, might not have been intended by the writers. It might have been something that they fell into, again, through alien metaphor. But it was something that transgender people invested ourselves all the same. I saw myself in the character of Dax. Dax meant a lot to me as a kid because I finally got to interpret myself into this character. But that is the kind of important distinguisher here. I had to do the work of interpreting myself. Whereas other identities in other shows, in other elements of Star Trek even, got to see themselves like, black people with people like Whoopi Goldberg or Uhura, Asian folks in the character of Sulu, things like that. While those identities actually got to explicitly see themselves, even while Star Trek talked about those issues, that face those minorities through alien metaphor, and sometimes explicitly, like Guinan often would talk about slavery, most notably in Measure of a Man. So they were used to talk about them explicitly and implicitly, but also just let them be part of the wonderful diversity of Star Trek and just be included in the future, regardless of their skin color, and not necessarily have to be dealing with their skin color. For trans and non-binary folks, we had to kind of do the extra work to interpret ourselves into this alien metaphor. So there is a problem there, but it's also there's also benefits to it as well, because clearly showing a transgender character at that time on TV would have been difficult for the writers to get to do. I mean, they had to fight just to do episodes on sexuality. So using alien metaphor can allow you to tell those stories without having to deal with censorship. But it also leaves people like me feeling left out in terms of explicit representation, and explicit representation is important to people feeling seen and feeling like they can take part in that wondrous project of humanity, that non-binary people or transgender people would still exist by the time we got to the Star Trek future. So while it's nice to be able to talk about our issues through alien metaphor and kind of see ourselves there, it's also important to see ourselves explicitly represented. So alien metaphor is not a bad thing or a good thing. It's sort of a net neutral thing that can be used correctly or badly, depending on how well the alien metaphor is written and utilized. And also when it's mixed with actual explicit representation, because using actual explicit representation is important. So again, this brings us to the non-binary and transgender characters on Star Trek Discovery. Because we learned when they initially announced these characters that Gray was going to be a Trill, and was going to be dealing with issues of being a host on the show, a Trill host, having that symbiote in there. So there was a bit of frustration of like, oh, we get our transgender representation, but it still has to be tied to this alien metaphor. We don't get a chance to, exist outside of that alien metaphor. But then we also had the character of Adira, which kind of allowed the writers of the show to sort of have their cake and eat it too. At least that's what I thought was going to happen. That Adira was going to be a non-binary character who is just going to exist as a human and be explicit representation, and then Gray would be transgender, either through alien metaphor or through actually being transgender and then also being a Trill on top of that. But there would be this character that existed outside of that alien metaphor-ness and sort of that confusingness and blurring of the lines of representation, that we would get Adira. Also, this is Jesse from the future, pausing this video because I just want to make something really clear here that I didn't make when I was actually recording this video, which is the fact that I don't mean to say that, oh, just because we have one non-binary character means you could do whatever with another transgender character of a slightly different identity. While non-binary people may be considered part of the transgender community, they don't represent all of the transgender community, as evidenced by the fact that Gray is a member of the transgender community and is somewhat different in his identity from Adira, who is a slightly different form of the transgender community. The trans community is incredibly diverse, and just because you have one member of the trans community does not mean that they have to be represented or that they should be representative of all trans people, and therefore makes any other trans representation in your story disposable. So I just want to make that kind of clear with this point. I just was sort of making the point here that by having a non-explicit transgender character and an explicitly transgender character, one using metaphor, one not using metaphor, that it could kind of allow them to explore both of these ideas as writers, both the alien metaphor part and the explicit representation part, and I found that to be kind of intriguing intriguing and something that I haven't really seen a TV show do all that much, especially in science fiction. So I just want to make that clear that I wasn't saying that, oh, because you have one, that they have become representative of the entire trans community, you can do whatever with any other member of that community, but it was just sort of an interesting writing tool that I was seeing the writers of Discovery using and was kind of intrigued by. However, that isn't exactly how it worked out in the show. As we saw in the most recent episode of Discovery, Adira also has the Trill host in her. I'm using her pronouns for the moment because that's the pronouns that the character has been using on the show so far. So even within this, like having a human non-binary character, she's still being tied into the Trill alien metaphor. And so it's still getting mixed up in a lot of transgender alien metaphor stuff. For example, we kind of saw this discussion of transitions with the character of Gray within the episode Forget Me Not. Gray got the host within him, and Adira kind of had concerns about the fact, like, oh, are you going to be different after you've had the host in you? And that sort of is sort of an interesting alien metaphor for how partners of trans people feel when their partner starts transitioning and coming out. It's like, oh, if you transition to another identity, will you still be the same person that I fell in love with? But again, that idea is being told through an alien metaphor rather than explicitly talking about that being an issue within our daily life. However, this gets in again into my complicated feelings on the episode. Because while all that stuff is true, and while I am somewhat disappointed that this human non-binary character still has to get tied into this alien metaphor, from what we can glean so far, and again, I can put an asterisk here because this may change down the road, but Adira being non-binary and Gray being transgender has nothing to do with the fact that they are dealing with alien metaphors through Trill. Gray could be transgender, and in fact, it looks like Gray did come out in transition before he got the Trill host. So he was transgender before he got the Trill symbiote. Adira has also come out, the actress who plays Adira in an interview has also stated that Adira knew that she was non-binary before getting to the Discovery. Now, again, we know that she lost her memory, so it's possible that she is non-binary because of her Trill symbiote, which would be a problem. It would sort of imply that something causes you to be non-binary rather than just being non-binary. It's sort of like the same thing of asking, like, what made you gay, when we know today that being gay is just something you are, nothing makes you gay. The same applies for non-binary, and saying that, like, the symbiote made her non-binary would be a problem because it would imply that. But as of right now, from what we can tell, Adira is not non-binary because of the Trill storyline that she's involved in. She's just non-binary and also involved in this Trill storyline. So, again, complicated feelings because there is this alien metaphor being utilized to talk about trans issues with trans characters that are intended to be trans. And we already see this being explicitly done in Star Trek Discovery. Gray getting the symbiote put in him is clearly meant to evoke what it's like to get gender confirmation surgery for many trans people. And Adira's concerns about him changing mirrors many partners of trans people who have many conflicting concerns about their partner changing while going through a transition or gender confirmation surgeries. So we already clearly see the writers using alien metaphor of the Trill to talk about trans issues in a non-explicit way, but still touching on those same themes. But their trans and non-binariness isn't necessarily tied to the alien metaphor. And so there is an element of me kind of appreciating the writers understanding how the Trill are such an important part of the transgender community's relationship to Star Trek. I as a trans person, relate to Star Trek through the Trill quite often. That's why they're my favorite alien species in all of Star Trek. So there is an element of the writers being like, oh, we understand this. We kind of want to celebrate that and tie these characters to that with you. But the thing that also kind of concerns me is there's a bit of a disappointment that I just don't get to exist separate from that I always have to be tied into those things. So to wrap out this discussion, with both the bury your gay and alien metaphor stuff, I am not hating it. These are tropes that, especially with the bury your gays part, can be problematic. The alien metaphor can be good or bad. The bury your gays trope is generally always bad. But they're being used in ways that aren't necessarily the typical way those tropes are harmful, kind of eschewing some of the ways that those tropes can be harmful. And so I kind of appreciate it, but also am kind of concerned that these characters have to be tied to those tropes to begin with. It's one of those things where it's like you're not doing it necessarily wrong in a way that I can completely like condemn, and I'm glad for that, and I'm actually finding it kind of fascinating as a viewer of the show to sort of delve into and discuss. But it also makes me saddened by the fact that I have to still be wrestling with these issues, when really I kind of just want to see myself having fun as a non-binary character within the Star Trek world. So it's kind of a wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey sort of thing. Again, getting to all these complex feelings. But I was having a discussion with Council of Geeks separately offline, who is a fellow YouTuber who talks about LGBTQ issues in geek culture, which you should totally check out her channel. But I was having a discussion with her, and she brought up a good point of, while the writers of the show do have a possibly legitimate story to tell that does not fall into the worst elements of these tropes, there is a bit of an arrogance, or at least it comes across as a bit of an arrogance. And this isn't me condemning the writers, but it does come across as slightly arrogant, of saying like, well, we know that these tropes have been done in the past, and we know they've been done bad, even within our own show, as we saw with Hugh Culber. But we think we can do it better this time. And maybe you're right. Maybe they will walk this incredibly tight line in a way that I find intriguing and interesting. But it does come across as like, well, you shouldn't have done it to begin with. And so while it might be interesting, and I don't want to like tell writers what they can or can't write, especially when they're trying their best to represent the trans and non-binary community well, it still leads me to this problem of like, I just wish you didn't have to tie us to these tropes. And it feels a little bit coming across as, and again, it comes across as smug. I'm not saying that they are smug or they are arrogant, but it comes across as a little bit arrogant. And I say that not as, just being very clear. This is someone who supports the show, who loves the writers and loves the work of the show and has loved it for a very long time. But I also want to be honest with my feelings and my critique about this. Hey, and pausing again from another quick message from Jesse from the future. I just wanted to quick mention and take note that apparently after our conversation and between me filming this video and releasing this video, Council of Geeks released their own video on the non-binary and transgender representation in Star Trek, and more specifically focusing on the bury your gays trope, and I agree completely with everything that they say in that video, so I would highly recommend that you go check it out and listen to their thoughts, because they have some really, really well articulated and emotional thoughts about the use of the bury your gays trope within Star Trek and across the board in science fiction and television in general. So I just cannot recommend enough, and I'll link it down in the doobly-doo for you. So that's sort of where I'm sitting here. I'm not condemning. I'm not angry or upset or like saying Star Trek Discovery is awful. And in many ways, I'm actually very intrigued and excited and very interested to see where this goes. But again, it gets into this complicated feeling of I don't feel fully bad or fully good about it. Also, this is Jesse from the future, one last time with the final pause of the video, I swear. But after all of this discussion about Star Trek, I forgot to mention that I also did a video with Philip Hawkins, who is a Doctor Who YouTuber, about the recent addition of a transgender companion to the Doctor Who canon in the recently released Doctor Who audio drama, Stranded. I had a really, really wonderful conversation with Philip, and I highly recommend you check out that video. It was a fun time, so I'll also link that down in the doobly-doo for you if you want to hear my thoughts on transgender representation within another huge science fiction franchise that recently came out. But I'd love to hear all your thoughts on this. Let me know in the comments below if there's something that I missed, something that you've been thinking about. Did you agree with me, disagree with me? I'd love to hear all that. Don't forget to subscribe for my reviews of Star Trek Discovery and other discussions of Star Trek and geek culture and important issues within geek culture as well. And also don't forget you can help me out on Patreon, because Patreon keeps the lights on. I don't know why you would support me if I can't say words like lights. That was a weird chuckle. It was like I was out of breath. I'm weird. Why do you support me? Anyways, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, especially Catherine Lambeth, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Miranda Janelle, Eli Berg-Moss, Ashlyn Solstice, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Randy Thompson, Chamomile Tea, Philip Sorbello, Munir Amlani, Boyd and Marybeth Earl, Stephen Schuthart, Wellington Marcus, Wayne Twitchell, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Dominic Noble, John Steele, Gavin Robinson, Michael Beam, William Stewart, Nathan Olson, Amanda Ronnie Indange, The Suspense, BBD, Hannah F., Miguel Posadas, Jason Knott, Maeve, Andrew Jorgenston, Sabraxis, Jasmine, Chris Brown, Bree Beecher, Nathan Steele, Chloe Dollar, Jane Packard, Dante St. James, Wendizzle Bizzle, Geek Filter, Mark the Edge, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Gretchen Badger, Sarah Bystam, Celestial Dawn, Polly Mina, Din, Jean Mithoon, Lysa, Andrew Lamoureux, Zone 1 Librarian, Michael Hardy. Thank you, all of you, especially this month.